And I'll start by reading the disaster declaration. As permitted by the governor's disaster declaration of April 28th, 2023, the determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee to ensure as transparent and open a meeting as possible. We posted the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance. We'll provide a recording of this meeting linked on the CMAP website, and we'll take all votes by roll call. So, few virtual meeting announcements. This meeting is being recorded. Please use the mute function when not speaking. If you're on the phone only, you can do the *6 to mute and unmute yourself. And if there's any members of the public, if you have any questions during the meeting, please put them in the chat box so that CMAP staff can see those and keep us apprised of any comments. And there'll also be a period at the end of the meeting for public comment. So if you're interested in making a comment, please enter that in the chat pod, and we will get to you shortly. And members of the committee, when making a motion, please include your name so that it can be properly recorded. So with those opening remarks, staff, could you call roll?
Yeah, thank you. If the committee members could please unmute themselves at this time, we'll call the roll. IDOT.
Here.
CMAP.
Yep.
CDOT.
Yep.
Collar counties.
Here.
Council of Mayors.
Yep.
CTA.
Yes.
Metra.
Yes, here.
PACE.
Here.
RTA.
I'm here.
FTA. FHWA.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So first item on the agenda, I'm going to turn it over to CMAP's Deputy Director of Transportation, Amy Lee, to give us a few words.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm now kind of settling in here. UWP Committee was kind of brought to my attention very early since joining CMAP. You know, my outside sort of experience with UWP Committee just kind of stood out to me as something of a committee that just operated altogether differently than a lot of our other committees. And so staff have been working pretty hard on trying to align, I think, the UWP Committee a little bit more in alignment with how we do other things. We want to look for consistency and transparency, and making sure that we're looking at how this program is going to be developed in a way that you know, allows for different voices to come in, but also to apply a lot of our same values around performance measures and criteria that are sort of consistent with some of the things that we want to achieve in the region. And so you all know that we are trying to do a little bit of a reset here around that. So Kama will be presenting on that more later, but some of the things that I think are really important for us to just impart with you on in our thinking is really wanting to make sure the UWP program produces deliverables that are going to be beneficial to all parties in the region. And so that's something that you'll see is something that we want to work on, making sure that how we invest those UWP dollars are generating things that are valuable and useful that can be shared with other agencies. The other thing, of course, that we're always reminded of is making sure that when we do allocate dollars and program dollars, that those dollars are being used before they within the time frame that we had hoped that they would be expended. That's something that I think John Donovan will support me on. But we just want to make sure that as we're moving in these directions, you can understand some of the basis for how CAMA is really approaching setting up the competitive program for UWP. I don't have any other announcements, but any questions or anything like that for me?
Thank you, Amy. I I do want to point out that, the agenda is set up to cover the items that Amy has kind of mentioned here. And so we've got a pretty decent content packed agenda. I do want to ask before we move on, though, if there's any changes to the agenda, please identify them at this point now.
Nothing from staff, Mike.
Okay. Well, hearing none, we can move on to approval of the minutes. A copy of the minutes from December 14th was included in the packet. Does anybody have any requested changes or corrections? Scott.
Yes, thank you, Michael. This is very minor, but I just wanted to make note that myself, I'm listed under members present, but I'm also listed below that under others present, sort of two locations. I don't know if that was meant to be somebody different, but that's a pretty minor change for CMAP to make.
Thank you. That's noted and should be easy enough. Are there any other comments or corrections on the agenda? Sid.
Yeah, I actually think that Scott being duplicated was intended to indicate that I was the other present for the collar counties.
I figured that he came in on video and then also called in, but yeah, your explanation makes more sense. Thank you. So does CMAP staff have that captured?
We will correct it.
Well, as promised, can we get a motion and a second to approve the minutes? And please state your name when making the motion.
Hennings makes a motion.
And a second?
I'll second. This is Heather Mullins.
Thank you. Staff, will you call roll, please?
Yep, members could unmute again. CMAP,
CMAP Ensign here. Aye.
CDOT,
Present.
collar counties,
Yes.
council of mayors,
Yes.
CTA,
Yes.
Metra,
Yes.
PACE,
Yes.
RTA.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Thank you very much. Well, next on the agenda is, let me look here, overview of MPO functions and UWP committee. If you didn't know, we're going to get a little metropolitan planning refresher. We're going to get one. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kama to kind of run through sort of what some of the core requirements are of the MPO and us in this capacity, and just so that we can kind of recalibrate a little bit. So Kama.
All right, great. Thank you, Mike. I think Amy touched on this a little bit, but kind of over the last few years, UWP development here at CMAP has kind of been evolving a bit. Also with the passage of the IIJA, additional funding programs have been introduced, along with additional planning requirements. So this committee paused the region's traditional competitive portion of the UWP so that we could all regroup to react to the IIJA and to provide more certainty and vision for the Metropolitan Transportation Planning Program and processes in the region. As we start the process for developing the fiscal year 25 UWP, we believe it would be beneficial for all of us to have an overview of the planning requirements and discuss how the UWP accomplishes those requirements. We've been brainstorming internally, talking to our peers, and reorganizing all of our committee procedures, and we want to share the status of that work with you today, along with suggesting next steps for this committee. Metropolitan Transportation Planning and Programming is, as most of us know, required under both Title 23 and Title 49. The specific requirements are described in these sections listed here, with Title 49 basically stating that the regulations in Title 23 shall be followed. The IIJA also continued the Metropolitan Planning Program with some additions and modifications that we'll talk about. So the very basic purpose of an MPO is to carry out a continuing, cooperative, and comprehensive, known as 3C, performance-based multimodal transportation planning process. This includes the development of a metropolitan transportation plan, as well as a TIP, and all guided by the planning factors that are set forth in federal law. So those planning factors include economic vitality, safety, security, accessibility and mobility, the environment, housing, integration and connectivity for people and freight, efficient system management and operation, preservation of the existing system, resiliency and reliability, and travel and tourism. We have a whole lot of things to focus on. And every transportation planning activity that we do should be addressing at least one or more of these factors. So digging deeper into the requirements, we most often think of the long-range plan and the TIP as those main required products of the MPO, but there are also a few other high-level requirements that include setting performance targets, developing a public participation plan, agreeing with each other on the planning process and information and data sharing, having a congestion management process in place, producing an annual listing of obligated projects, planning for safe and complete streets, and of course, producing a unified planning work program. I'm not going to go through, details on all of these, although there are a lot of words on the upcoming slides. But I do want to highlight just some kind of key terms and points out of all of these regulations, and kind of ask everybody to keep these key terms in mind in the context of confirming what activities we should be including in our UWP, and then thinking about how each of your agencies contributes both directly and indirectly to these requirements. So trying to think about how we'll frame the UWP structure more aligned with these requirements. So the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, or the Long Range Plan, is a nearly continuous work product. We're always developing, updating, or implementing the plan. As we think about the work tasks to support the plan, some of the key terms that jump out are identification of the facilities, forecasting, performance measures, targets, and system performance, a financial plan and strategies, including operational, management, and capital investment strategies. The long range plan is also the place where a lot of background work happens, like the socioeconomic forecasts, the travel demand and air quality modeling. So much of the work that we do contributes to the long range plan. The TIP is another product that is always ongoing, and in fact is governed by not one, but 4 sections of Title 23. The TIP is how we tell the public and each other what we're spending federal funding on, what are the projects that are so significant that they require federal action, and how those projects in the TIP reflect our priorities and make progress toward our targets. The TIP project listing includes an extraordinary amount of details about the scope, cost, and schedule of projects, and is updated both administratively and by formal amendment whenever needed to continue to meet those requirements. Those revisions are one of the things that CMAP definitely cannot manage without all of our partner agencies. There are 4,000 projects in the TIP, and CMAP is only directly responsible for about 200 of those. So it's all of you that are responsible for the balance of projects. Another major requirement is the setting of performance targets. Setting these targets and measuring progress in meeting them is data intensive work, and coordination is required because the state, the MPO, and transit providers must all set targets, and those targets must be consistent with each other. Both the setting and monitoring of targets is data intensive work that is best accomplished through our partnerships with each other. The MPO's participation plan is about defining, carrying out, and refining how the MPO engages with the public, including how the public participates in the development of the TIP, as well as the federally funded Section 5307, 5310, and 5339 program of projects. There are certain agreements that MPOs must have with the state and transit agencies. These agreements determine our mutual responsibilities for planning for the region. These agreements must address how we develop financial plans for the long range plan and TIP, how we report obligations, and how we develop and share information and data. While valid, our existing agreements can be reinforced through the UWP, both in how we select the work to be done and by whom, and also through the actual contract language of the UWP. Congestion management is a planning area that we are required to focus on. CMF is working this year and really probably into next to update our congestion management processes. Much of the work implementing the processes and strategies is appropriately funded through the UWP. The annual obligation report is also closely tied to the TIP and is a required product that CMEP cannot produce without data and assistance from our partners. Finally, just a reminder that with the enactment of the IIJA, we do have to dedicate at least 2.5% of our planning funds that are contained in the UWP to complete streets planning for safe and accessible transportation for all people in all modes. So all of the work that we do to meet those requirements and to support the federal planning factors is documented in the UWP. The UWP itself also has several requirements. Generally, the UWP is a budget book that must detail the who, what, when, why, and how much of the transportation planning process in the region. The UWP is also required to document transportation planning activities that are funded with other sources of funding. And there are reporting requirements that staff will discuss a bit later. The federal requirements for a work plan and detailed budget are reiterated by the state via the IDOT MPO Cooperative Operations Manual. That manual explains that MPO staff is responsible for the development of the document with input from the MPO Policy Committee, IDOT, and our partners. Once approved by the MPO Policy Committee, IDOT transmits the UWP to the USDOT for approval. Just like the TIP or any other budget document, revisions can be made and may be so minor that they can be made by staff or may require an amendment to the original document to be approved by the MPO Policy Committee. So with all of that background in mind, to prepare for the FY25 UWP development cycle, staff has been doing some internal brainstorming, talking to our peers, and reorganizing of some of our committee procedures. And we wanted to share the status of that work with you today, get some preliminary thoughts from all of you, and suggest some next steps for this committee. So, faced with a global pandemic, as public agencies, we all had to make some kind of quick adjustments to our procedures to be able to continue conducting our business and to continue engaging the public in that business. As we tried to shift gears for each and every committee within the agency, we realized just how many committees we have and that the status of each as a formal committee or as an informal working group can really have a profound impact on what we are required to do and how effective each group is in carrying out its business. With this realization and direction from the MPO Policy Committee, staff proposed some changes to the committee structure for discussion by the Transportation Committee. While the Transportation Committee has not made any recommendations for structural changes, they did accept staff's recommendations to better document our committee procedures by strengthening and in some cases establishing bylaws for each of our committees, as well as confirming the membership, purpose, and mission of each. So we do expect bylaws to be improved in June, and we'll share those at this committee's next meeting. As noted, the Transportation Committee hasn't restructured our subcommittees and working groups. And in fact, they requested that staff conduct a formal peer review of some other MPOs and then have further discussion about that committee restructuring. So as part of this peer review, there's been some specific focus on UWP processes and procedures. And so that review has begun. Staff has identified a small group of peer MPOs for in-depth conversations about the UWP processes. And those conversations are being scheduled and starting to occur this month and next. And we anticipate discussing the results of that peer review with this committee in July. Finally, the internal brainstorming, thinking about the planning requirements and thinking about what this committee's been discussing really over the last couple of cycles. We've been asking ourselves and now want to ask all of you, really, which of the planning requirements require assistance from all of you, whether that's in the form of staffing, data, or deliverables. What activities can most efficiently and effectively be accomplished by our partners versus CMAP staff. Something that comes to mind for me there is like boarding and alighting counts for transit, right? That's something the transit agencies can do so much more efficiently than CMAP can. Then also, how do we avoid redundant work by better coordinating and better data sharing? Would a menu of scope elements or a formula program facilitate better efficiency, reduce redundancy, and provide us that better funding certainty from year to year? And then once requirements are met, what are the extras that we could develop via a competitive program? And are any of those extras activities that, maybe extra because they're not directly tied to the requirements, but might be something that this region actually sees as core must-do things? So I think I'm going to pause in my talking here and kind of let you all think on these couple of questions for a minute, and and hitting you a little bit blindsided, but sometimes your gut reaction to questions like this garners the best discussion. So with Mike's permission, I'll go ahead and say, throw out your thoughts.
What's the target for completing the congestion management plan?
That is an excellent question, Mike. I believe that is scheduled through, I know it's scheduled through at least the beginning of our fiscal year 24. Amy, do you know the target completion date? Amy Lee or Amy McEwen?
I don't have the completion date, but I know that you're right. We'll be kicking that off first thing with the new fiscal year.
Yeah.
Awesome. And thank you for that. And yeah, sorry for blindsiding you with that one, but just to give the group a little bit more context on the UWP, it's a budget document, but kind of the way I look at it, right or wrong, is this is basically the scope of work for the MPO, and it's the scope of work that we use to execute our annual operating agreement. And literally, when we get invoices from CMAP, we're checking to make sure the activities are in the scope of work, and we ask for progress reports, things like that, percent complete on different activities. And I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that some of the federal partners who are approving invoices and things like that are kind of maybe they're checking our work and not what we got from CMAP. But the UWP really kind of lays out the scope of activities for the MPO for that particular planning year, and associates it with the budget that we're entering into agreement for. So reacting to Kama's questions here, if there's any planning requirements that committee members feel like they're going to be needing to assist with for their agencies, is there anything that can be done more efficiently by partners? How do we avoid redundancy? Things like that are sort of questions on the table for this group. And maybe this is planting a seed, or maybe there's some things coming to mind right now. So if anybody has anything, feel free to speak up. Sid.
Yeah, I guess I have a question in response to your question about redundant work through better coordination and data sharing. That seems to suggest that there has been work that has been seen to be redundant. What work have we determined that there's too much overlap and could have been streamlined, that this committee has particularly approved in the past?
Honestly, Sid, nothing comes to mind. It's one of those things that is kind of a remember to check this as we're having this conversation, that we don't want, CMAP shouldn't be counting boarding and alightings and also having, the service boards counting those. There's I think a little bit of overlap throughout the region where, counties are working on long range plans, as well as CMAP working on the overall long range plan. And, there's going to be a little bit of redundancy there. But staff didn't identify anything major, but wanted to, also have the check with all of you to make sure that you don't see us repeating work anywhere, or you don't feel that, you're being required to do something that should be done by somebody else. So it really was meant to be an open question, not a, hey, we know we're wasting money here, let's not do that anymore. I don't think that's really the case. It's meant to be a logic check and just garner some thought.
Okay. Well, then a follow-up question, and then Dave, I'll let you jump in here. My apologies. So I guess, as a county that just completed our long range plan within the last year or so, I would be interested in what CMAP's view is of our long range plans as they fit into the MPO's long range plan. I think, and this may have been a few years ago because it took us a little bit to get through our planning process, but we essentially got concurrence from CMAP staff that our assumptions and our technical work was roughly in line with the MPO's transportation plan. And so what is that relationship between the MPO and the counties going forward with those overlapping tasks?
I don't want to speak on behalf of the agency on this. And I see Craig's not on the call, but it is one of the things that we talked about as staff is, can we do a better job participating in the county long range plans to ensure that, all of the data, we validate the model on a regional level. You're validating the model more locally when you're doing your long range plan. Are we missing coordination opportunities? I don't think we are, but it's something that we should talk about as we scope these projects out. And then making sure that, what's in all of your long range plans gets incorporated into the appropriate place in CMAP's long range plan. So thinking about the modeling years, we have 4 or 5 scenario years in our model, and making sure that we capture, changes to the regional long range, the sub-regional long range plans in those scenario years in our plan. So, that kind of coordination. Amy, Lee, I see you nodding. Was there anything you wanted to add there?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, Cam. I mean, there's certainly things that we want to see alignment at the regional level, but there's certainly a lot of local understanding that is that you help us shed light on when you do your county long range plans that we want to, be aware of and make sure that as we sort of go through this continuous regional update of our long range plan, that we're mindful of how there are unique things going on in each of the counties.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate those comments, and I would certainly, the next time we get around to our long range transportation plan or an update, would invite you guys to be part of the process with us, and would appreciate your involvement.
Thanks, Sid. And I think that's part of too, talking about, as we move further this year and talk about what projects will be funded as core versus what projects are more appropriate as competitive, thinking about where that coordination between these projects being done by our partners and projects being done by CMAP, where that coordination needs to happen and how we can ensure that in the contracts between us, right? So, keeping that in mind and making that a more formal agreement to do that data sharing is going to be important. So
Absolutely.
I think Dave Tomczyk had something too.
Yeah. Cam, this is interesting in terms of, what activities and what's redundant work. I guess the question is going back to, identifying what the solutions are, but what is the problem? what activities are we doing as a, that, you know, the transit data ridership is easy because that's focused on say the transit agencies, but that comes about in counties, you know, various studies, right? Everybody, you know, whether it's a comp plan, even a local TOD plan, county plan, update plans, everybody talks about transit ridership. But I guess what else is out there that there is the overlap? I mean, in terms of like, you know, mapping this out from the planning requirements and what is collected or who's doing activities. You know, trying to get the mapping as to what is being done and who's doing it, and you know, and I guess I'm just trying to have a hard time figuring out where those overlaps are. You know, like I said, the transit ridership was an easy one, but what else is there? I mean, I guess modeling travel market patterns, travel, you know, those type of things. But have we ever kind of set those buckets up and see where those overlaps are and going, you know, focus on planning requirements, because that seems to be what's driving this, correct?
Mhm.
And then so I don't know. I mean, this seems like something that you know, there needs to be more digging into this as to what are those of, you know, redundant work, because right now, how can you answer that?
Right. Yeah. You know, again, I don't think, you know, how do we avoid redundant work? It was just meant to make us think today, not meant to say that we're doing redundant work. And, you know, I think that more than anything, making sure that, you know, we're talking to each other about what we need to do. You know, we're thinking, you know, there's a new strategic plan from the RTA, and what, you know, what activities can all of us be doing to help implement that? What activities can everybody be doing to help implement onto 2050? But that are outside of the things that each of us are, you know, required to do. Where is there required work to be done? You know, that maybe we all see as our responsibility and could be more efficient if just one of us led that, whether it's CMAP or somebody else. And Alex, do you want to throw something in?
Yeah, thanks, Kama. I think another way to kind of think about this particular question is less about redundancy and more about how our data could help each other. Like maybe there's some data that you're collecting through one of your UWP funded projects with PACE that could be helpful to Metra or vice versa. And I know we do some of that data sharing already because we all talk to each other and we're all in lots of these meetings together, but doing a little bit more formally and using the UWP to formalize, I think could help us all streamline our work. So it's not so much about redundancy as about, you know, maybe you don't need to collect as much data if, you know, you can also use some of this proxy data from a Metra study. I think that's kind of where we were coming from with that question.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely, Mayor Einhorn.
What about, I haven't heard a word about our neighbors, particularly Indiana. And I don't know if we're going to reach as far as Wisconsin, but I don't think we are. But, you know, out here, Indiana is obviously a big influence to what happens. We're accommodating an awful lot of people from Indiana traveling in this area. And I haven't heard one word about interfacing with the next door neighbor.
Yeah, you know, we do have agreements in place with NERC and with Southeast Wisconsin planning the MPO there. You know, covering that within our UWP is not something we do, and so I didn't really focus on it today, but you know, we do have to have those agreements where we share non-attainment areas, and so we have to share data across our borders. You know, we have agreements on how we split some of the transit funding across our borders with Wisconsin and with Indiana. So, you know, there is coordination. They sit on our committees. We sit on some of their committees. You know, could it be better? Probably. But it does happen.
Emma, I'm here too.
Okay, thanks,
And I
Terry.
couldn't figure out how to raise my hand. I'm sorry. Mayor Einhorn, we do have conversations with folks in Indiana and in Wisconsin on their MPO boards. And as Kama says, we do have representation there. And normally, we do attend their meetings as well. And we do a lot of collaborative, at least discussion, especially about air quality, because our problems end up being their problems and their problems end up being part of our problems. So we do have those conversations.
I don't want to sound argumentative, but quite a few years ago, I was called to go to a NERC meeting where I thought there was going to be some kind of large cooperation and discussion and planning for cross-border transit of all different kinds, particularly roads. And that thing, I got called to one meeting and never heard a word from them since. And the problems out here getting across the state line are not good. And I have not heard anybody step up and explain to me or anybody else in this southeastern area as to how they're going to solve these problems, because they have allowed pretty much wholesale residential development to block every type of corridor that would ever have been here. And I don't see it getting better. In fact, I see it getting worse daily. And I don't hear anybody even chirping at all about how you're going to solve this problem. And it's significant.
And
I think I'm gonna ask Amy and myself and Terry to write this down as well as coordinate with you. But as we're scoping out here the next long range plan update, making sure that we have some tasks in that update to strengthen that coordination is probably a step in the right direction, and making sure that we're doing what we can to influence those decisions that we don't have any jurisdiction over their land use decisions, but we can certainly step up that coordination. And so making sure that that's a major task in that next plan update is probably what we can promise today for sure.
I don't want to sound argumentative, but the die has already been cast into Calumet City, Burnham, and Linwood and those areas already. And Indiana is expanding so far south so fast. It's honestly it's really unbelievable, quite frankly. If you haven't been out this area, you ought to take a trip, because it's astounding what they're doing. And it seems to me it's just basically wholesale residential development. And there's no easy way to get anywhere out in this area. So
I appreciate that perspective for sure, and figuring out how we can step up that coordination is something we can work on. I see several other hands. I don't know what order they went up in, so I'm just going to take them left to right on my screen and say, John Donovan.
yes.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on the mayor's comments. I actually got a MPO meeting with the folks in Kankakee as soon as this call's over. So immediately to the south, and Mayor, you're absolutely right. They're dealing with the exact same issues at MPO. And not only are they kind of throwing their hands up in the air, that they've been bringing the added issue of all the freight traffic is taking the county highways and local roads. Basically tearing up the roads, creating safety issues, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a great example of exactly why this committee exists, to help identify planning priorities or areas where the planning process may have overlooked some needs out there. I mean, that's the exact reason why there's local representation on this group. That's the exact reason why this entity exists. So I think to a T, this is why this type of coordination is needed. So with that, I'll let someone else speak there.
Heather?
I was going to change gears, so if Brandon want to talk on that same topic, I'll let him go.
Mine was, I wouldn't say changing gears, but kind of a quick note. It's a simplified version of looking at the UPWP that I find helpful is that, you've got your MPO long range plan, and that dictates, how the area wants to develop the transportation system over the next 20 years. And then the kind of, arms of that plan are both your TIP and your UPWP. So really, just like anything that's in your TIP needs to align with that long range plan, the activities you take in your UPWP should align with what you have in your long range plan as well. So definitely, I think as you move into this update cycle, taking some time to reflect, see what's aligning, see what could use some help, and then working with partners to identify those things is certainly helpful. We're fully supportive and willing to assist in this process, as Mike's here as well, but in whatever capacity that we can.
Thank you, Brandon. Heather?
Yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about kind of the second half of this document here. For the competitive program, currently, the only agencies that can apply for competitive funding are members of this committee. Is that correct?
Traditionally, that's how it's gone, yes.
Okay. I mean, is that something you're looking at opening wider or changing the membership of this committee at all? And maybe I'm getting too far ahead of things.
No, I don't think you're getting too far ahead at all. I think that, the intent, certainly with brainstorming today, is to be open to whatever makes sense. I think that the folks on this committee are good representatives of the major planning players in the region. And so not necessarily thinking that anything needs to change with the membership, but, one of the reasons why you're seeing me here today is that, I've been doing project selection for STP, along with, other colleagues in the programming group who do project selection for CMAC. And, those are trying to think of the UWP more as a funding program, similar to those programs. So it doesn't, CMAC focuses on air quality and STP focuses on other things, and the UWP focuses on transportation planning. So, how do we ensure that, the UWP deals with our core stuff, which is what I talked about, but also, figures out how to, there are tons of planning projects in the region that we want to do. So how do we prioritize those? How do we pick the ones to be funded with this particular fund source? And so, I don't have a proposal in mind yet, but thinking about, step one being, what do we need to take care of first, right? These are the things we absolutely have to do, and this is the funding we have to do it. And then what else do we want to do? And then how can we develop a way to more methodically, I think, and with more predictability, develop that kind of competitive program, whether we call it a competitive program or assistance program, whatever it is, it's the other planning activities that we want to fund once we've covered all of our requirements. So.
Okay. And Cam, I'm very pleased to see you here today. So I'm glad you're here. But to follow, and I didn't have any suggestions for that. I was just kind of curious, what all was involved here. But you have mentioned here if you want like a menu of scope items. And I think that's maybe a good idea, and maybe not scope items, more topical areas to include each year for the competitive program, just to narrow it down to make sure that we are getting applications in that support the current priorities for the region. I think that's something that makes some sense. I'm not a huge fan of the formula. Was that more for core or competitive?
Was thinking that more for core. Okay. And I don't know how many folks are familiar with, the Council of Mayors scope for the UWP funding, right? There's a set of things that that program is designed to help CMAP accomplish. Programming of STP, communication with municipalities. And so, each of the councils is kind of given that scope, in the next couple of months, and we say, okay, develop the budget that you need for your council to accomplish that scope. And all 11 of those come back and get combined, and that's the budget that's then presented to this committee for the core inclusion in the UWP. And so thinking about, should the core in general be approached that way for all of the agencies, right? There's a certain set of things that we just went through that the MPO has to do, so should we be looking to all of our partners and saying, these are the things we have to accomplish. What's your proposed budget for helping us accomplish those?
Okay, well, I won't write off a formula program altogether, but I'm always suspicious of it. But I'm done. You guys can move on from.
The thing that came to mind when you were running through this earlier, and maybe it was because Dave's picture was up at the top, was something like Transit Asset Management Plan. There's a requirement for an agreement between the MPO and the transit agencies to share information on a transit asset management plan. So, some of that stuff the transit agency has to do anyway. Some of that needs to come over to CMAP through coordination. There's probably work that could be, appropriately included in a UWP budget related to sort of coordinating TAM type stuff. And that could be a good core program because it supports ultimately a requirement for both agencies. So I don't know if that's a good example or a bad example, but that's just the kind of thing that came to mind, because when Kim was talking, I was kind of thinking, we just ran through the requirements. And so, some of these questions are maybe geared towards the things that the partner agencies need to be doing to support the MPO and how that fits into the annual budget requests from each entity.
For sure.
So, Buck, I'm sorry, were you going to add on to that?
Nope, I was going to recognize Buck.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Let me lower my hand. So first of all, I don't have a ton of experience with CMAP, so you'll have to forgive my ignorance on programs and other initiatives. But what is CMAP doing? Because specifically pertaining to coordination and data sharing, CMAP's kind of sandwiched an interesting position between county and state in terms of kind of tiers of governance. And when it comes to data sharing, that becomes an inherently hairy issue because we're dealing with multiple tiers of governments and then as well different data standards and whatnot. So I'm wondering if CMAP does anything to kind of help facilitate lower tiers of jurisdictions to even develop their own data, kind of as a preceding process to data sharing, and that could include technical capacities like data frameworks, standard operating procedures, so on and so forth, so that opposed to, data sharing in just in a top-down way, it becomes almost circular, where sure, we give information from the top down, but then cities or, other jurisdictions sort of take that, run with it, and then start updating or generating their own data to be shared back up in a common format.
Go ahead, Amy.
Is that okay? Yeah, I appreciate your comments on that, Buck. I think that's a growing issue, right? As we all are collecting data, more and more, we're all in these our own piles of data and trying to think about how does it all come together and make sense, and how do we better leverage it to make collectively better decisions as a region. I'm new here, but that is something that is a priority of mine within our group that I really want us to move on. And to the extent that we have willing partners who can see value in standardizing data, whether it's collection of safety data, things like that, we certainly want to keep our door open and add some value in that discussion if there is a desire for us to do that. But to that point, the other thing that I thought of when I first got here was when it comes to UWP, if we are talking about redundancy, I don't know if this is really redundancy, but multiple agencies pay into subscription services like near maps. I think that there are opportunities to achieve some discounts if we thought about collectively going in on those sorts of subscription services. Is that something of interest or desire by partners within this committee to explore?
Just my own personal opinion, I think it's always a good option to explore, but I think it's also important to consider that even though a number of groups in any sort of instance like this will kind of use the subscription service, that's important that whatever data that would be coming from that is capable of being reproduced or put together in a way beyond that subscription as well, just so that the data is, or these processes aren't completely and 100% totally dependent on any one service, so that kind of functional flexibility I think is pretty important.
Amy, when I saw you nodding, I thought you were going to say, I've been trying to get data from CMAP for years, but it would have been with your tollway hat on, and I forgot you switched over.
Yeah, I switched. That's why I have to put CMAP in parentheses over there under my name.
I'm going to fix everything. David.
Yeah, this, in terms of like, Amy, you mentioned NearMap. I mean, RTA has we're under RTA, and Metra has the program for NearMap. And I think they tried to get, I think CMAP had their own at the time, and it wasn't, I don't know all the details, but yeah, that's an example. And then when IDOT had not Rembrandt, but the
replica.
Thank you. And so when that got lost, that was a big chunk of information that I know we used, PACE used. But when IDOT stopped that was we don't have a subscription on our own, and it's either them or there's other systems out there. But yeah, I mean that's a perfect example. Like if for travel data, the near map, I mean there are these elements out there that would be, if there could, we could have these joint subscriptions and services would be very beneficial. But yeah, I mean there's things out there already. It's just not totally formalized, or all the groups are together with them.
And to that precise point, I believe we're in the process of reacquiring access to replica data. So that might be something that Brandon can follow up on with Elizabeth Irvin, and we'll find out what kind of sharing capabilities we've got with the subscription that we're getting. So that's a good example, though. There's a lot of data out there. It can be very costly, and we at IDOT do pursue data sharing capabilities whenever we have to make a purchase.
Yeah, and Mike, I mean, we actually had it in one of our project scopes that there is, IDOT had this program, we had to take it out, but that we prefer to use the IDOT data as being, and if the consultant was they had that membership that a lot of the consultants were part of for the replica data. But we had it in, for example, like in scopes we were requiring it, but it was suggestive of using the replica data preferred. So there's another example that if not having that in there, we had to make adjustments to it.
Understood. And we can talk more about that on the side, but it is a good example. There are definitely data sources that are expensive, and a lot of different entities are using them. And we've actually set up a statewide group of MPOs to discuss data sort of on a regular basis throughout the year to try to identify not only data that would be valuable to purchase, but then how to implement that data purchase in a way that sort of maximizes the use, because in the case of Replica, there weren't a lot of people using it and it was very, very expensive. And so we had to let that go offline for a little bit, but I think we are bringing it back. So do we have any more on sort of the brainstorming piece? And before we move on, I just want to, so we kind of talked about, it sounds like the UWP and folks work to support the UWP and how that might help inform core. But we also had Mayor Einhorn and John Donovan talk about sort of the scope, geographical maybe scope of the UWP, and making sure that we're considering and maybe coordinating with neighbors and factoring in impacts, that could be coming in, and maybe, involving some of those neighbors or even some of the entities inside the boundaries of CMAP to help us understand a little better what's going on. So I guess I hope that gets captured too.
For sure. Any other brainstorming thoughts before I move off of this and talk next steps?
Can I interject real quick?
Absolutely.
In the last 2 or 3 years, the world kind of went from round to flat, and we were not passed up by that kind of reaction. And so I'm almost wondering whether or not any of the data we've collected in years past is honestly valid anymore. So how are we responding to this? As an example, I don't know if Metra's on here or not, but their ridership it's gone haywire. And I just wonder, how does that affect our overall plans? And is it going to, and do you ignore it and just figure it's going to come back, or do you adjust for it, or what do you do? Who's got I don't know that there's any right answer, because I don't think any of us have got a crystal ball, but at some point you have to ask that question and figure out what the answer is. And I don't personally have any, I don't have any ideas as to what that means.
Well, I'll just, Mayor, it's David Kralik from Metro, just specifically since you called it out. We do have a lot of activities that we are engaged in right now to try and answer that question. Some of those are based on data that we've requested in past from for UWP funding, but I think clearly the need to collect current and upfront data and then develop our plans as we move forward from them is paramount. So I was going to hop in and just second the idea. I know this was mentioned also in the chat, that but second the notion that there's value in collective approach and coordinated effort to secure some of these subscription data sources, some of the other joint efforts where there may be some cost benefits from this. And I'm very encouraged by the thought to do that. And specifically to your question, Mayor, we are going to have some more outreach through this, both in the information we've already shared in our strategic plan, which definitely take a look if you haven't had a chance to yet, but in more details in a upcoming Transit Tuesdays discussion. We'll be talking about that and some other activities going forward.
And again, the reason I ask this is because, especially like Metra, they make enormous investments in equipment and stuff. And then if the ridership isn't there, it's like, why did we do that? And, I guess roads are probably in the same category in a lot of ways. And, things nowadays can change so fast that you can't even keep up with it. And, it's just kind of a frightening thing, because we're not talking about, small amounts of money. We're talking huge amounts of money that may be spent for naught. And I guess that's just, I'm just a little nervous about some of this stuff.
John, you had a thought before I move on?
Yeah, what I really like about the issues that the mayor's brought forward to this group is the idea, like you said, changes are happening fast, and that's not uncommon. If I've had a complaint about this committee in previous years, it's about being stuck in kind of the culture of what this committee has been for a long time. Looking at things core versus competitive. What did we get last year compared to the year before, compared to the year before, compared to the year before? This group has been very tied towards doing things the way they've traditionally been done. I won't go into the whole spiel. There are some pretty new members here. At some point, I'll go into my big long talk about how this is one of the few administrative survivors of essentially the old CATS days when the MPO was a subset of the state government. There are still influences of that being felt to this day in how this committee operates. It's probably time to really start trying to move away from that. And be able to be flexible and be able to be responsive to the changes going on out there. That's, again, in my opinion, that's the whole point of this committee. Identify those holes in the planning process, identify the possible opportunities, as we've talked about some of those as well. But because we get very fixated on how is my group doing compared to last year or the previous years or 5 years ago or to my neighbor or whatever the case may be, that has really prevented this group from thinking in a more holistic way for some time now. So I'll be very interested in kind of the peer review discussion next time. But really, this group has an opportunity to be the voice, help produce the voice of the MPO, because the MPO is not the CMAP staff. Everyone on this committee is on this committee because they bring a different flavor, they bring a different voice, and you can identify things in your regions or in your modes or whatever the case may be, probably better than the CMAP staff can in many respects. And that's no criticism at all to the CMAP staff. But that's the needs of a region. So I'll get off my soapbox at the moment, but again, I think those two issues that the mayor brought up are perfectly indicative of why we need to look a little bit more holistically at what we're doing here.
I think I'm the only person that actually served on CATS and the Council of Mayors way back. That was a long time ago. I was a vice chairman.
It's a long time ago, but we still operate this committee tied to a lot of things from those very days.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue, John, to kind of thinking about our next step. So as mentioned in the chat, we'll get the slide deck out so that everybody can see not just the highlights, but kind of read the in-depth on the requirements and think more about these brainstorming questions, as well as the things we heard today. How can we, how do we change our focus when we're coordinating with our neighbors? Where can we do better with data sources? John's absolutely right. I have no idea what data sources might be useful to PACE or to McHenry County or, to CDOT even. So, tell us, let's have that discussion and let's figure out how to work all of that into our planning work here and the work plan for our planning work. And that budget and then figure out, okay, we're able to save some money with that coordination. Now we've got an opportunity to do some extra planning and what are the priorities of this committee and of the MPO policy committee for that extra work. So perfect segue, John. Thank you. Thinking about our schedule, there is a proposed calendar later on the agenda that Alex will cover, but we do expect, over the next 2 meetings to share those peer review results, to make a recommendation on how to approach the core budget and work plan, and then start providing some options and making recommendations for competitive program methodology. So all of that looking towards the milestone of September, October for conducting a call for proposals, and then looking towards the November meeting to review the results of the call for proposals, and have a staff recommended program of planning projects for the region. That would probably also be the proper time to invite comment from the public, and have this committee be considering a final program in December to recommend for the MPO to approve in January. So, that's kind of that traditional timeline we've been on. It gives us a lot of work over the next couple of months. The cat's going to help with that work, apparently. So that's where we're at, and we'll get those slides out and look for any additional brainstorming thoughts as you've had some time to think through it. All right, off the mouth. Here we go.
I've got a couple questions real quick. Can you provide any more specific questions you plan to ask other MPOs during your peer review?
Noah, are you on? Can I put you on the spot, Noah, if you're on and paying attention? Because I think Noah Harris on our staff is coordinating that. There you go.
Hi, yeah, this is Noah Harris. I'm an associate policy analyst here at CMAP. Yeah, we have a long list of questions that we're going to be bringing to peer agencies. Some of them are around the structure of competitive programs. Some of them are around data sharing standards. We can follow up. We'll definitely present the full list of questions to the committee and are open to feedback if you have any questions that you'd like for us to include.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting. It's a good idea, healthy thing to do. I guess I was just curious. And then the other thing that I don't know, it probably came up 9 months ago, plus or minus, maybe longer. The last time we went through the core project discussion, the competitive project discussion, the idea came up that folks that had been awarded competitive grants should come back in front of the committee and talk about the status of their projects, how things are going, things like that. I guess if if this group is going to continue sort of dealing with this competitive proposal thing, I guess I wouldn't mind to see and hear from grantees from earlier cycles, how things are going, share information about your progress. If there's been problems getting projects up and moving, what are these problems? Can they be mitigated? Or should we, maybe pull back and throw the money back into the pot? And I'm not saying that's the purpose of it, but sometimes these projects get hung up for various reasons. It would just be healthy to hear how things are going with previous awards.
Yeah, for sure, Mike. That's on staff's radar to schedule for each meeting. But I think another thing to think about, and kind of coming back to the CMAC and STP and how we run those programs, there are status reports associated and reporting into staff, reporting into each other, and thinking about how to make that just a part of our regular practice, right? So, making sure that we, can assist people when they're falling behind and can accelerate people when they need to be accelerated, and, not getting so stuck on getting stuck, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it. So the more tuned in we are to the progress that projects are making, the more helpful we can be in letting them be successful. So absolutely.
Yeah, it may even help inform future project ideas. And so anyway, thank you for that. Does anybody else have anything for CAMA before we move on to the UWP reporting requirements? Well, I guess, hearing none, we'll go on to agenda item 4.02 and turn it over to Alex Sensen.
Thank you, Mike. I'll just also, before we move on to this next item, dovetail a little bit of what Cam has said, because I think one of the things we're going to be looking at with these process improvements and part of that peer review process is looking at some of the criteria and specifically like project readiness criteria that we can incorporate into the competitive program to help make sure that projects that get awarded, I think, can really be completed in the 3-year time frame, because we know that's one of our priorities with the program. So definitely more to come on that. So I'm going to go through this section pretty quickly, and as we said, we'll email out this PowerPoint so everyone has access to this. But I just wanted to run through some of the reporting requirements, and I will confess that I'm not the expert on the reporting requirements. So we do have some other folks on the line, including Penny, who could answer questions if you have any specific questions about reporting and contract agreements and things of that nature. Next slide, please. So through the UWP program, every agency that we grant money to through this program goes through an intergovernmental agreement, and that requires some various things to be submitted with the agreement before it's executed. Those include a line item budget, hourly rates for staff, travel policy, scope of work and budget. It also requires that we receive invoices from you on a regular basis. It's strongly encouraged to submit them on a monthly basis, but you can submit them quarterly. We just ask that if you do submit them quarterly, that you do it no later than 15 days after the end of a quarter. This is really important for us to be able to make sure that these amounts that are billed are an allowable cost so that folks can be reimbursed. And then when you email those invoices and other supporting documents, including your quarterly reports, please email those to your project manager if you have one, to the UWP reporting email that I know we've sent out previously. I think folks have already been doing a great job of that. But then also include accounting at cmap.gov, cmap.illinois.gov, just to make sure that we all get all the same documents we need. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, when you submit your invoices, you can do it monthly, but if you do send them quarterly, you do also need to send some other separate reporting deliverables. So those include a quarterly report that's basically includes a project narrative. So letting us know the accomplishments that were achieved during the quarter, as described in the statement of work, including interim project deliverables, and then your funding expenditures for the quarter. Each of these projects also needs to include annual reporting. So at the end of every fiscal year, include the final project narrative in your annual report, detailing the work that's been accomplished, a final expenditure report, and any final deliverables. Next slide, please. So as we touched on earlier in the brainstorming section, we do already have a data sharing agreement in place that does go into these contracts when they're executed. But this things we want to strengthen through this process. So even though this text already exists and we do already require data sharing, we want to really look through this and see how we can improve our data sharing agreements, how we can make the data more useful to each other. So there will be some recommendations coming out of this when we go through the peer review and look at their data sharing agreements in other jurisdictions, for example. Next slide. The last big piece, but not the least important, has to do with procurement. So anyone who's receiving funding through the Unified Work Program needs to follow the procurement codes that are outlined in that agreement, and has to make sure to follow all of our procurement policies and procedures. That includes rules regarding subcontracting. So no subcontracting can be done without written consent of CMAP. Purchases of less than $10,000 have to get at least 3 qualified sources so that we can ensure that you're getting competitive bids. For purchases of above $10,000, you do have to follow a formal competitive process through an RFP or an RFQ. You have to make sure there's no conflict of interest. And then very importantly, you cannot hire any of the Pritzkers to do any lobbying on your behalf or anyone else's behalf. don't think anyone is doing that, but just to make it perfectly clear, that is not allowed. Are there any questions about any of the reporting requirements? And as I said, we're going to send out this wall of text later after this committee meeting's over.
Well, if there's no questions, we can move on. I've just lost my agenda though, but I think we're going to move on to 4.03, which is the state FY24 UWP committee schedule, also being handled by Alex. So take it away, Alex.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, so these are the dates that we propose for the state fiscal year 2024 schedule. So our next meeting would be on July 19th at 1 p.m. And then we'll meet again in September, November, December, and then next year we'll meet on May 8th. If there are any objections, please let us know, but otherwise I think we could go ahead and request approval of our meeting schedule for the fiscal year.
Will there be any remote options for future meetings?
Great question. At the moment, with the disaster declaration expiring tomorrow, we do need to meet in person and have a physical quorum in person for these meetings. There is a remote option allowed under the Open Meetings Act, but you have to follow several requirements for that. So, for example, if there's an illness or if there's some other reason that you can't attend the meeting in person, you can attend virtually. But we need to have a physical quorum in place regardless. We will still allow for virtual public participation, even as we return to in-person meetings, just because we want to make sure that we're providing an accessible venue for people to participate publicly and for being as transparent as possible. So meetings will still be recorded and there will still be a virtual public participation option, but you will have to be physically present at the old post office, which is a really nice building. You'll enjoy visiting it.
If one were to participate remotely and they had like cameras on, would their face be projected onto like a very large television screen for everybody in the room?
I can't promise that it won't.
Okay, well, I just wanted to make sure people were aware that it's better to be there in person. So does anybody have any other questions on the committee schedule? Hearing none, can I get a motion and a second for approval? Please state your name when making the motion.
So moved. This is Heather Mullins.
Thank you. And a second?
This is Buck Doyle, I second.
Are there any questions or anything before we go on to roll call? Okay, let's hear a roll call.
CMAP,
Yes.
CDOTS,
Present.
Collar counties,
Yes.
Council of Mayors,
Yep.
CTA,
Yes.
Metra,
Yes.
PACE,
Yes.
and RTA.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on to item 5, new business. Is there any new business to come before the committee?
I don't know that it's new business, but it's just a question about the new report, like the email, how we administratively deal with CMAP. Before we were just emailing Dan, and I've just had a little bit of no response when I've emailed questions about some administrative things to CMAP.
Hi, this is Penny. Yes, Dan is no longer with the agency.
Yeah.
But I am more than happy to assist you in any way that I can.
Okay. That'd be great.
Okay.
Can you put your email in the chat, please?
I certainly can.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Dave. I have a question, I guess for Alex. When do you see the FY24 IGAs being released?
So I might not be the best person to answer this question if anyone else would like to hop in, but I know that IDOT is currently doing legal review of our CMAPs and the comprehensive budget for the region. I don't think I've got a time frame for that. I did ask the finance team a few weeks ago, and they said they're not sure when they would be in place. They would definitely be in place before the beginning of the fiscal year, but couldn't give a more comprehensive timeline than that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, because my grants and accounting department keeps asking, so I keep telling them we'll get it. We'll get it. Don't worry. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions or new business? Well, we can move on to public comment then. Staff, have we received any public comments? Or is anybody identified in the chat box they would like to make a comment?
We did not receive any comments ahead of time, and I do not see anything in chat. I think we have a small enough group today. Mike, if you just want to ask folks to unmute themselves if they wanted to make a comment, that's probably appropriate, or raise a hand.
On that suggestion, would anybody like to make a comment? If so, please feel free to unmute yourself. Hearing none, we'll move on to 7. Next meeting, as mentioned earlier, is going to be July 19th. It'll be held in person. And if there's no other business, can we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Hennings.
Second?
I'll second. Tomzik.
Yeah, and if there's no opposition, this meeting's adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks. Enjoy the
Thank
weather.
you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. See y'all later.